Barakatah Yahweh Shai, Barakatah Yahweh, Barakatah Yahweh, Barakatah Yahweh Shai.
My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. My Father which gave them me is greater than all, and no man is able to pluck them out of my Father's hand.
Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahushai, Bahashem, Rakah Kodash. Yahweh is the name of the Heavenly Father in the ancient Hebrew, and Yahushai is the name of His only begotten Son, the Messiah, who the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ. Double honors to the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. Okay, just gonna, do a continuation, going into Daniel 11. Okay, today, last time we ended off in the fourth verse. All right, so, today I'm going to cover the fifth and the sixth verse. It's not really too much, in here, so that's why I lumped the fifth and the sixth verse together. All right, but let's just get right into it. All right, so this is Daniel 11:5. It says, "And the king of the south." Now, like I said, being that it is a continuation of, from verse 4, you at this point, all right, you have the Persians have gone down. All right, the Persians have been taken down by the. I'll just sum it up. All right, you have in the time when Daniel was saying this. All right, you had Cyrus, which is the king, but the three kings that were yet to stand up were Cambyses II, Bardia, and Darius the Great, and then the fourth that came after them was Xerxes. All right, Xerxes the first, the one you see in the movie 300. Okay. Now eventually, he goes up and invades Greece. That's where you have the whole Battle of Thermopylae, and then later on down the line, Alexander comes. That's that mighty king in verse 3. All right, who eventually takes down the Persian Empire. Okay, and after he takes him down and establishes the Grecian Empire, he dies. Okay, and upon his death, you have you have a lot of chaos that brews out of it. A lot of backstabbing, a lot of civil wars, a lot of alliances being made. All right, for the division of his kingdom. All right, eventually he gets divided up, amongst his generals, but you have four notable ones that come up, and take it over. So after that division of Alexander's kingdom. Okay, let's look up, let's see, the Diadochi, let's see. So when we pull this up here, all right, as you can see, this is a map of the Near East, okay, and you have, it tells you who has what over here. Okay, so now we're at the point where, Seleucus has this whole area, Ptolemy. Now, Ptolemy has Egypt, Cyrene, portions of Asia Minor, all right, Pamphylia, so on and so forth, Cilicia. Okay, he also has Cyprus, and he eventually gains control of, some islands up in the Aegean. Okay, so Ptolemy would be the king of the south at this point in time. All right, starting with Ptolemy the First Soter. Okay, which the word or the name Soter means savior, and he got that by defending the island of Rhodes. Okay, so they gave him that name savior. And then the king of the north, all right, in the beginning was Seleucus, as I have here. Okay, Seleucus the First Nicator, which means victor. Okay, see, so as you can see over here, so now let's go Daniel 11:5. It says, "And the king of the south shall be strong." All right, and that was Ptolemy the First Soter. Okay, let's read a little bit about him. All right, it says here, Ptolemy the First Soter. Now, Ptolemy grew up, all right, with Alexander. Eventually he was in Alexander's army. I believe he became Alexander's bodyguard and so on and so forth. But after Alexander's death, he used his diplomacy and so on and so forth to really gain that portion all right, of Egypt, and then he expanded on it. All right. So it says here, he was a companion of and historian of Alexander the Great, um, of the kingdom of Macedon in northern Greece, who became ruler of Egypt, part of Alexander's former empire. Ptolemy was pharaoh of Ptolemaic Egypt from 305 to 304 BC to his death. He was the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt until the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC, turning the country into a Hellenistic kingdom and Alexandria into a center of Greek culture. And I believe he also in Memphis, he basically established a temple for Serapis Christus, all right, which was supposed to be like a unification of the Greek and Egyptian deities, putting it together and strengthening the bond, all right, between the native Egyptians, all right, and the Greeks, because this Ptolemy, all right, these guys were Edomites, all right, that had taken over that land of Egypt, all right, and so they were ruling over those native Egyptians, okay, and so of course there was going to be some form of hate and distrust and back and forth between the two, and that's why he did what he did to try and mend that so they could work, as a whole. It says here, he was the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Okay, I read that. Ptolemy I was the son of Arsinoe of Macedon by either her husband Lagus or Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's most trusted companions and military officers. After the death of Alexander in 323 BC, Ptolemy retrieved his body as it was en route to be buried in Macedon, placing it in Memphis instead, where it was later moved to Alexandria in a new tomb. Afterward, he joined a coalition against Perdiccas. Now, Perdiccas, it says here, the royal regent over Philip III of Macedon. Perdiccas was, the royal regent. All right, so he was sort of like, he wasn't the actual king, but he had the power of it because those that were supposed to be the actual kings were at the moment incapable of handling that responsibility. Hence, Perdiccas for a time period was in charge doing things here and there. All right, eventually, it says here, the latter invaded Egypt but was assassinated by his own officers in 320 BC. Okay, and that latter, that was Perdiccas. Now, what's interesting is, as we're about to read, it says, allowing Ptolemy I to consolidate his control over the country after a series of wars between Alexander's successors, and that was known as the Wars of the Diadochi. So it says, Ptolemy gained a claim to Judea in southern Syria, all right, which was disputed with the Syrian king Seleucus I Nicator, his former ally. Now, the interesting thing is that mutiny that ended up having Perdiccas killed was orchestrated by Seleucus, all right, amongst two others, because Seleucus was in that army, okay, of Perdiccas. Okay, so he orchestrated that to where they basically mutinied and assassinated or took out Perdiccas, which was the regent. Okay, now notice here it says Seleucus was a former ally of Ptolemy, and when we read about Seleucus, you'll see why. It says so Ptolemy gained a claim to Judea in southern Syria, which was we know who was in Judea, all right, which was disputed with the Syrian king Seleucus I Nicator, all right. And when we get to the First Syrian War, all right, or the background of it, you'll see how or why this eventually led to those Syrian wars. And it was called the Syrian Wars because it was over that portion of Coal Syria. It says he also took control of Cyprus, all right, which is this little island right here. Okay. Where are we at? And Cyrenaica, the latter, which was placed under the control of Ptolemy's stepson Magus, all right, which basically should be pretty sure it should be around here. All right, let's just look at it. It should be in Cyrene, or it should be Cyrene. Let's see, Cyrenaica images. Let's see if we could get a clear one. All right, as you can see right here, basically the same area. Now let's read a little bit about it and let's see what they say. Okay, it says Cyrenaica is the eastern coastal region of Libya, also known as Pentapolis in antiquity. It formed part of the Roman province of Crete and Cyrenaica, later divided into Libya Pentapolis and Libya Sicca during the Islamic period. The area became known as Barca after the city of Barca. Sounds like Hannibal's last name, which he was around. He did live around that area. All right, so Cyrenaica, Cyrene, basically the same area or in the same region. Okay, so going back, it says Ptolemy the first. All right, this is just excess information that we don't really need. So we know a little bit about Ptolemy. All right, going back to Daniel 11 and 5, the king of the south shall be strong, and Ptolemy was strong. And now it says, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion, and his dominion shall be a great dominion. And that prince, when you go into the word prince, all right, it says here, that one of the definitions, you have prince, ruler, leader, chief, chieftain, but you also have captain, a general, commander, in when using it in the military sense. All right. You also have a vassal, somebody under the king. All right. You have a chief. Okay, so it can be you can use it as merchant princes of rank and dignity. All right, so it can be used in different contexts. All right, as you can see, one of the definitions here also is patron angel. Okay, so you see it says here outline of biblical usage. So this is how the word prince is used, because there are accounts where angels are referred to as princes. All right, let me see. I believe if my memory serves me right, Daniel 12 and 1. Exactly. Daniel 12 and 1. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince. All right, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. Okay, and then it goes on and tells you what he's going to do. Okay, so just to give you some understanding on the word prince, automatically we just think of somebody who's the son of a king, but it can be used in different ways as well. And in this way, it's being used as in a military sense. All right, because let's read about Seleucus. All right, it says Seleucus the first Nicator. Seleucus the first Nicator, which means victor, or Seleucus the victor, was a Greek general and one of the Diadochi, the rival generals, relatives, and friends of Alexander the Great, who fought for control over his empire after his death. Having previously served as an infantry general under Alexander, he eventually assumed the title of Basileus, which is king, and established the Seleucid Empire over the bulk of the territory which Alexander had conquered in Asia. Now, if you notice, it says his dominion he shall have dominion, and his dominion shall be a great dominion. Because when you look here, look at look at Seleucus. All right, his territory in comparison to everybody else. All right, he had the biggest portion, extending all the way to India. All right, to the Indus Valley or Indus River, right here. Okay, I believe it was the Indus Valley, but so it says after the death of Alexander in 323 BC, Seleucus initially supported Perdiccas, the Perdiccas we read about, the region. It says the region of Alexander's empire, and was appointed commander of the companions and chiliarch of the partition, at the partition of Babylon. Now, when you look up the companions, it was basically, like it says, an elite cavalry of the Macedonian army from the time of King Philip II of Macedon. So like a high level, a group of the army. Chiliarch is a military rank dating back to antiquity. It says, however, after the outbreak of the wars of the Diadochi in 322, Perdiccas' military failures against Ptolemy in Egypt led to the mutiny of his troops in Pelusium. Perdiccas was betrayed and assassinated in a conspiracy by Seleucus, Python, and Antigenes. All right, in Pelusium, sometime in either 321 or 320 BC. At the partition of Triparadisus. Now, the partition of Babylon was when they all got together and said, "Hey, we're gonna divide up Alexander's kingdom," and then eventually they divided it amongst all the different generals. All right, and then about 3 years later, okay, or 2 years later, they repetitioned at the partition of Triparadisus, okay, because during the time of the partition of Babylon, I believe the regent or the ruler, right, the regent king at the time was Perdiccas. But after he was done, the regent at the time became Antipater, okay? So they redid it again, and they said, all right, you get this portion, you get this portion, so on and so forth. So it says, at the partition of Triparadisus in 321 BC, Seleucus was appointed satrap of Babylon. All right, so he was in control of Babylon under the new regent Antipater. But almost immediately, the wars between the Diadochi resumed, and Antigonus forced Seleucus to flee Babylon. Seleucus was only able to return to Babylon in 312 with the support of Ptolemy. All right, from 312 BC, Seleucus ruthlessly expanded his dominions and eventually conquered the Persian and Median lands. Seleucus not only ruled not only Babylonia, but the entire enormous eastern part of Alexander's empire. Hence, you have all this thing right here. Okay. Now, let's see. We're going to go down to here. It says admiral under Ptolemy. Okay. And as we looked up the word prince, all right, one of his princes, we saw the terms that were used. All right. Shar. It says here, a captain, general, commander. Okay, now let's look up what an admiral is. Admiral, military. It says an admiral is the commander of a fleet in the Navy. Admiral is one of the highest ranks. The military is full of ranks such as captain, private, major, and corporal. Another is admiral, a ranking specific to the Navy. Okay, and so as we read, one of the definitions here was what? Captain, general, commander. Okay, and as we read here, admiral is the commander of a fleet, and Ptolemy did put Seleucus, all right, in command of one of his fleets. I want to see if I could just skim to that area. Let's see. Okay. It says, after arriving in Egypt, Seleucus sent his friends to Greece to inform his fellow Diadochi Cassander, ruler of Macedon and overlord of Greece, and Lysimachus, ruler of Thracia, about Antigonus. Antigonus was now the most powerful of the Diadochi, and the others would soon have to face him. Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Cassander formed a coalition against Antigonus. The allies sent a proposition to Antigonus. Basically, long story short, he wasn't with it. They ended up going to war. You know, when you skim through all of this, they ended up going to war in, I believe, 301 or 302 BC, and they took him out. Now, I'm looking for the area where Ptolemy basically made or gave Seleucus some ships, all right, and had him go defend Rhodes. Okay, let's see. All right, it says here, Seleucus acted as an admiral to Ptolemy during the first phase of the war. Antigonus was besieging Tyre when Seleucus sailed past him and went on to threaten the coast of Syria and Asia Minor. Antigonus allied with Rhodes, the island had a strategic location, and its navy was capable of preventing the allies from combining their forces. And then you can read a lot more about it. Nonetheless, going back to the point, all right, now you know these two individuals. You had Ptolemy the First, all right, the king of the south, and then you had Seleucus the First Nicator, which Seleucus ended up dying. You know, Seleucus the first ended up getting put to death by Ptolemy's son. Okay, because Ptolemy, when you look up here, let's look up his issue. If it'll show us his children, right? It says one of them was Ptolemy the second Philadelphus. Okay, but I believe another was Ptolemy. Yep, right here, Ptolemy the second Cyrannus. Okay, now Ptolemy Philadelphus, the one we know. All right, he was the younger brother. All right, Ptolemy Cyrannus was the older brother. But they, the way things turned out, things didn't go in the favor of the older brother. So the older brother, he dipped. He escaped out of there and he went over to, I believe he went to Macedon. All right, let me see. Let me confirm that. All right, he basically fled to Lysimachus in Thrace and Macedon. And then through some mischievous acts, he causes a court intrigue over there, and then allows Macedon to now get taken over by Seleucus. Okay, so Seleucus comes over, takes it over, and then he takes Ptolemy Cyrannus into his inner circle, and then eventually Cyrannus kills his ass. All right, and that's how Seleucus the first dies. Okay, but nonetheless, Daniel 11. See, here's where you need to understand, because as you're reading through the different verses, there's points where it jumps. It might skip through time. Okay, and you might think that it's talking about the same person in verse 5 and verse 6 because of the pronouns. All right, and it sounds like a continuation, but it's not. So you got to be cautious with that. So verse 6 has now skipped because verse 5 it says the king of the south is strong. We're starting off talking about Ptolemy the first. Verse 6 is now talking about the end of the second Syrian war. All right, because the bulk of Daniel 11 is talking about the 6 Syrian wars. All right, when you look up Syrian wars, it will tell you, it says the Syrian wars were a series of 6 wars between the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, successor states to Alexander the Great's empire during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC over the region called Coel Syria, which is Kal Syria, which is all Syria. One of the few avenues into Egypt. These conflicts drained the material and manpower of both parties and led to the eventual destruction and conquest by Rome and Parthia. They were briefly mentioned in the biblical books of the Maccabees. All right. So these Syrian wars is basically the war over Syria between the king of the north, which you often hear, and the king of the south. The king of the south was dealing with the Ptolemies, and the king of the north was dealing with the Seleucid dynasty. All right, so Antiochus comes from the Seleucid Empire. All right, so before we read Daniel 11 and 6, let's take a look at what this is right here. What is the Syrian wars? It says a little bit background. In the wars of the Diadochi following Alexander's death, which just means the wars of his generals or his successors, Coel Syria initially came under the rule of Antigonus Monophthalmus, which was also one of the generals, but he had the largest portion. And so we just read about how Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Cassander, and Seleucus basically had that coalition to take out Antigonus. And then, they split up the different portions among themselves. In 301 BC, Ptolemy the first Soter, who 4 years earlier had crowned himself king of Egypt, exploited events around the Battle of Ipsus. That's the Battle of Ipsus is where they defeated Antigonus, to take control of the region. The victors at Ipsus, however, had allocated Coel Syria to Ptolemy's former ally Seleucus I, Nicator, founder of the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus, who had been aided by Ptolemy during his ascent to power, did not take any military action to reclaim the region. Once both were dead, however, their successors became embroiled in war. All right, so this area, let me close this out. This land of Coel Syria originally was supposed to be allotted to, Seleucus. Ptolemy takes advantage of all the chaos that's going on and claims that joint for himself. Seleucus knows that that's not his, but, due to the history they had, they didn't want to go back and forth. But eventually their sons come and, that's when, things start getting heated. Okay. So when you see here, it says the first Syrian war, a decade into his rule, Ptolemy II faced Antiochus I. All right. Ptolemy II was a son of Ptolemy I, Soter, and his name was Philadelphus, which I believe is a lover of a sibling or lover of brother or so. Faced Antiochus I. Antiochus I, Theos, which means, Antiochus I, Soter, Salakia, all right, which also means savior, was the son of Seleucus. Okay, now what I will do is, let's see, Ptolemaic dynasty. Let's see if they give us something useful. I would love for them to put it in a list form, but they don't put it in a list form. So, okay, there we go. Let's see when we could utilize this. All right. So here you go. You have Ptolemy II, his wife, Ptolemy III, Ptolemy IV, Ptolemy V, the sixth, and then, so on and so forth. All right. But they don't give it to you in a list form. All right. Which is a shame. But anyway, you can always, look it up. But going back to the Syrian war. So now these are the sons, all right, of those two kings that didn't go to war with each other. But there was reason to, right? So a decade into his rule, 10 years into his rule, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, faces Antiochus I, the Seleucid king, who is trying to expand his empire's holdings in Syria and Anatolia. Now, Antiochus would be right to do so because originally it belonged to his father. But Ptolemy's father already had taken control of it. So Ptolemy, he now comes into power inheriting it. And he's like, yo, what you think you're doing, bro? It says Ptolemy proved to be a forceful ruler and skilled general. In addition, his recent marriage to his court-wise sister Arsinoe of Egypt had stabilized the volatile Egyptian court, allowing Ptolemy to successfully carry out the campaign. The First Syrian War was a major victory for the Ptolemies. Antiochus took the Ptolemaic-controlled areas in coastal Syria and southern Anatolia in his initial rush. So, boom, it breaks out. Antiochus the first says, "I'm taking this joint back, and I'm taking this place. I'm taking this area back as well." All right, that's what leads to war, and what happens in the war. It says Ptolemy reconquers these territories by 271, extending Ptolemaic rule as far as Caria and into most of Cilicia. Okay, which Cilicia is right here. All right, and I believe Caria should be somewhere around this area here. All right. Western Anatolia. Yep. So it says, with Ptolemy's eye focused eastward, his half-brother Magus declared his province of Cyrenaica to be independent. It would remain independent until 250 BC, when it was reabsorbed into the Ptolemaic kingdom, but not before having triggered a sequence of Ptolemaic and Seleucid court intrigues, war, and ultimately leading to the marriage of Theos and Berenice. This is what it's talking about in the 6th verse. But I just want to give you a little bit of context before that. So from verse 5, we're dealing with Ptolemy I, Seleucus I, right? They've worked together before, so, they didn't really do anything. In between that time of verse 5 and verse 6, Ptolemy II comes, Antiochus I comes, they go to war, which is the First Syrian War. Ptolemy wins, okay? But that's not the end of it. You have the Second Syrian War, all right, which is about 9 years later. It says, 60, 70, 11 years later. Antiochus succeeded his father. Antiochus II succeeded his father in 261 BC, and thus began a new war for Syria. Now, I think a good way to do this is if I just pull up. Let's get a blank. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to do, let's put the writing up, about 18. And we're going to do Ptolemy. All right, Ptolemies and Seleucid dynasty. All right, Ptolemaic dynasty. All right. So you have Ptolemaic dynasty. Who do we have? You have Ptolemy, the first, Soter. All right, which means savior. And then you have Seleucus, the first, Nicator. Nicator. Maybe I just bring the font down a bit. All right, you have Seleucus the first, Nicator. These two did not go to war, okay? But after them, you have their sons, right? Ptolemy the second, Philadelphus. He goes to war with Antiochus the first, Soter. All right. So this was the first Syrian war. Okay, right here, between these two guys. Boom and boom. Right. Now he wins. Right. He's the victor. He wins the first Syrian war. Okay. What happens now? The same Ptolemy. I'm gonna just write it again. The same Ptolemy the second. All right. Philadelphus. Then goes to war with this guy's son, all right, Antiochus the second, Theos, okay, and this is the second Syrian war, all right. So just so you can follow along, okay. So you have the Ptolemaic dynasty. Let's make that bold. All right, Seleucid dynasty. That's bold. This is the first. These two don't go to war. Okay, they're good. These two go to war. All right, him and him. Ptolemy wins. Then Ptolemy ends up going. So this is the first Syrian war. All right, first Syrian war. And then there's the second Syrian war. All right, so that's what we're reading about right now. Antiochus the second, all right, who is the son of Antiochus the first, he comes up, and let's hear why he wants to go to war. It says Antiochus II succeeded his father in 261 BC and thus began a new war for Syria. That's why it's called the Syrian Wars. It's constantly over this portion of land. He reached an agreement with the current Antigonid king in Macedon, Antigonus II Gonatas, who was also interested in pushing Ptolemy II out of the Aegean. All right. So Ptolemy, this is the Aegean, right? Ptolemy got some, because there were some islands around here, right? So Ptolemy has, forces over here, and Antiochus II, he wants Ptolemy out of here. He wants his land back. He teams up with Antigonus II Gonatas, right? Okay, Gonatas, who's like, I want shit. That's good for me because I want Ptolemy out of here, so I'm going to help your ass. All right, and so they have that second Syrian war. It says, who was also interested in pushing Ptolemy II out of the Aegean. With Macedon's support, Antiochus II launched an attack on Ptolemaic outposts in Asia. Most of the information about the Second Syrian War has been lost. It is clear that Antigonus's fleet defeated Ptolemy's at the Battle of Kos in 261, diminishing Ptolemaic naval power. Ptolemy appears to have lost ground in Cilicia, Pamphylia, and Ionia. So all these different lands here, okay, that he originally had, he lost that. Okay. It says, while Antiochus regained Miletus and Ephesus, Macedon's involvement in the war ceased when Antigonus became preoccupied by the rebellion of Corinth and Chalcis in 253 BC, possibly instigated by Ptolemy, as well as an increase in enemy activity along Macedon's northern frontier. The war was concluded around 253 BC, and that's what brings us to Daniel 11:6. At the end of years, all right, they shall join themselves together. That was the conclusion of the Second Syrian War, all right, as we're about to read. The war was concluded around 253 BC with the marriage of Antiochus, and this is Antiochus II Theos, to Ptolemy's daughter, Ptolemy II Philadelphus. All right, like we have here. Okay, so these two make peace. He gives his daughter, Berenice, as we're about to read, Berenice Syra, which I believe means dowry bearer. Let's see. Yeah, her name was also called Phernophorus. All right, so dowry bearer. Antiochus repudiated his previous wife Laodice and turned over substantial domain to her. He died in Ephesus in 246 BC, poisoned by Laodice. According to some sources, Ptolemy II died the same year. So let's see. See what it says here with Antiochus. Right. So Antiochus II, this is what we're reading here, Daniel 11:6, right? And in the end of years, they shall join themselves together. This was the end of the Second Syrian War. They joined themselves together as a form of, ending that war. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. And it was an agreement through marriage. Okay, so you had Ptolemy II, that was the king of the south, and his daughter, Berenice Syra, came to the king of the north, which was Antiochus II Theos, to make an agreement through marriage. She was going to marry him. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. Now, what does this mean? When you read, as we're about to read, when she went up in there, eventually the agreement didn't really stand because we're about to read it. But Antiochus ends up, he has to divorce his first wife Laodice in order to marry Berenice, to make the agreement in the first place. Later on, he ends up going back to Laodice. He's like, "Oh, you stay here." He misses his old wife, so he goes back to Laodice, right? So it says, "She shall not retain the power of the arm," right? That agreement that she was going to basically be the the wife. Her son is going to become king. That basically now is dying down. Neither shall he stand nor his arm, because he goes to Laodice, and what happens to him? She puts him to death. She poisons him. Okay, so now he's dead, and that he being Antiochus II Theos, but she shall be given up, because eventually what happened to her? Laodice ends up, or her conspirators end up killing Berenice. Okay, it says, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, her father also died. He wasn't killed by them, but he died. And he that strengthened her in these times. Okay, so now let's read the history of it, okay, of what actually happened. All right, and so we're going to read about Antiochus II because it gives us a little bit more about, what happens, through all this, right? So it says he inherited. All right, we're just going to skip through to the main part. Okay, in 253 BC, in the aftermath of the Second Syrian War, Daniel 11:6, Antiochus II made peace with Pharaoh Ptolemy II Philadelphus. He divorced Laodice and married Ptolemy II's daughter Berenice. All right, that's the first part. At the end of years, they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. All right, that's what we're reading about. Let me close this out. All right, so he divorced Laodice, which was his first wife, and married Ptolemy II's daughter Berenice, with the understanding that any children born from their union would inherit the Seleucid throne, the power of the arm, the agreement. That was the understanding. But she didn't retain the power of the arm. Why? It says here, it says, for she shall be given up, because she does die. All right, but anyway, let's keep reading. Although no longer queen, Laodice was still a very powerful and political influential figure, because she wasn't just any ordinary woman. Antiochus gave Laodice various land grants throughout Anatolia, and that's Asia Minor, which are also known through inscriptions. That's where you get Laodicea. All right, Laodicea is named after Antiochus's wife, Laodice. She owned a large estate in the Hellespont, other properties near Cyzicus and Leon and in Caria. In a royal record at Sardis, mentions her land titles were to be kept as royal land in disposal in grants or sales. It says, during her stay in Ephesus, Laodice continued numerous intrigues. All right. And if you're curious about it, intrigue definition. All right. It says, arouse the curiosity of, make secret plans to do something illicit or detrimental to somebody, to conspire. Okay. So if you have like a court intrigue, it's a conspiracy in the king's court, maybe to kill him or cause some form of commotion. Right. So that's what she did. So it says here, she continued numerous intrigues to become queen again, because she's originally queen, but her husband is like, yo, I'm about to marry a new chick, so now you gotta fall back. You think she's just gonna sit there and take that? Hell no. This is basically like some Game of Thrones, for those who watched it, kind of scenario. So it says, by 246 BC, Antiochus had left Berenice and her infant son Antiochus. Okay? Don't get it confused. Antiochus is not a name, number one. Antiochus is like a title, So this here is talking about Antiochus II, Theos. All right? He left Berenice, the woman that he married in the agreement he made, and their infant son, whose name was also Antiochus. All right? And it says, in Antioch, so that he could go live again with Laodice in Asia Minor. Once again, what? She shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, what? Through marriage, and that her child will basically become the king, but she shall not retain the power of the arm because the agreement fails, because what? He leaves her. All right? Neither shall he stand nor his arm, and we're about to read about that, because it says he leaves to go live again with Laodice, the first of Asia Minor. Laodice took the occasion to poison Antiochus, while her partisans at Antioch murdered Berenice and their infant son. Antiochus was buried in Bellevue mausoleum. Okay, so there you have it. She shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm. The agreement fails because Antiochus II leaves her to go back to his previous wife. When he does that, he ends up getting poisoned by his previous wife. She shall be given up because that same previous wife, Laodice, ends up having Berenice put to death. All right? And they that brought her, and he that begat her, because at this point, her father, Ptolemy Philadelphus, is now basically dead. Okay? And he that strengthened her in these times, and what happened to Berenice, not only did they put her to death, but they also killed her son, Antiochus. Okay? So, this is the ending of Daniel 11 and 6. Okay? This is talking about the ending of the Second Syrian War, the agreement that was made, but it ends up failing. And then all this does is it just throws them back into more turmoil, all right, of war. Okay, and I'm going to end it off here. Next time we'll go into verse 7, all right, which basically goes into the war that was sparked, all right, based upon Berenice's brother, that was that branch out of her roots, Ptolemy the third, all right, Ptolemy the third Euergetes. He basically comes up and he sees what goes on and he's upset, so he declares war. So it's known as the Third Syrian War, but it's also known as the Laodicean War. Okay, so as we can see here, just a quick recap. Let me erase this. All right, let's bring this down a bit. Okay, so Ptolemy the first, let me just put it like this. Peace. There's peace between the two of them. All right. But when you come to their sons, you have the First Syrian War. All right. First Syrian War is between these two. Okay. And then you have the Second Syrian War, which is between Ptolemy II. So he fought in 2 of these wars. All right, Second Syrian War between him and this guy's son, his son, right? And that's Antiochus or Antiochus, the second Theos. Okay, and the ending of this war was where you have the what we just read in Daniel 11 and 6, and then the third war, which we're gonna get to. All right, Ptolemy the third, Euergetes, which is gonna be the third Syrian War, and that's between him and Seleucus the second. I believe it was Callinicus, but let's just confirm and make sure. Yes, it was. Let's see. Double L. All right. So that's what we're going to get into. And really, this is all just secular history. But what is it doing? It's showing you that what? Daniel, number one, Daniel was not alive during this time period, the 3rd and 2nd century BC. Daniel was not alive during this time. All right. And the time Daniel got the vision, he got this vision, Alexander wasn't even born. All right. Alexander wasn't even born yet, because this was during the first year of Darius the Mede. Okay. So this is after, right after Babylon falls around 539 BC. And we're dealing with events that are taking place around 270 something BC, 253 BC. I mean, so imagine how many hundreds of years that is. All right, but we're seeing these prophecies come to pass. So how do you explain that? Okay. Anyway, I'm gonna end it off there. Lord willing, this was edifying unto the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahushai, Bahasham, Rachak Wadash. Until next time, Shalom.